Could I ask if it goes even farther back? What comes to mind is Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. There's a famous chapter in there in which he contrasts Plato, whom he views as a radical, the man who wants rule by the philosopher kings, with Aristotle, whom he views as a kind of piecemeal reformer. What you get in Plato is the impulse to start anew, and what you get in Aristotle is the impulse to accept the givenness of things and make one change, see how it works, another change, see how it works. In other words, I guess what I'm getting at is there some sense in which these two visions can be traced all the way through the Western tradition?
Oh, absolutely.
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's a fair statement.
Yes.
All right.
A genealogy is tracing your ancestry. So here you are, right? And you had parents, and your parents had parents, and your parents had parents, and you can imagine a timeline going back like this, right? And eventually you can say, oh my God, these are my ancestors, right? There's all these people and so on. And where we are now, you can imagine this N here, this is now, and clearly all of this N is going to be the past, because the now is just an instant, so all of that's going to be P, it's going to be the past, right? Where we are now is dependent on how the past was. You wouldn't be here if it wasn't for all of your ancestors. All of us are who we are and the way we are in large measure because of who our parents and their parents were and so on. You wouldn't exist if it wasn't for them. And moreover, you wouldn't be the specific sort of person you are if it wasn't for them. That's your genealogy, right? We're going to do a genealogy of ideas. You can think of ideas are the same, right? I'm going to put let's see, a big orange dot here, right? You can think of an idea. You find the idea now. So that's over here. So this orange dot over here, that's an idea that you find now. But guess what? That idea didn't just kind of pop into existence right now. It has a history. Ideas have a genealogy. They were born from previous ideas that were born from previous ideas, and they have like parents, if you will. Ideas grow. Ideas give rise to other ideas. Like the child of an idea is basically its logical consequences. And then you can think of premise and conclusion, right? You can think of the premise as the parent and the conclusion as the offspring or child, right? You have got the premise and it leads to a conclusion. And then that in turn gets recycled as another premise, like children become parents and so on. Ideas grow, ideas evolve through time. So what I'm going to give you now is a genealogy of certain ideas, and not any kind of ideas. Ideas that make progress, political disagreements, impossible. And I told you it's going to be a big history. I'm going to start over here. Now, here's the interesting thing. When engineers were building these, because even if you have access to a lot of manual labor to build these, you still have to plan how you're going to construct these things, because they're massive structures and they're geometrically perfect. And the architects, Egyptian architects, had a little gimmick to figure out the sides of a right-angled triangle. So that's a triangle that has a 90-degree angle at one of its corners over here. So it's inner corners. That's a 90-degree angle. So they didn't quite know how to measure these things, but they had a formula. And the formula was this: 3, 4, and 5. They knew that this gave you a nice right-angle triangle. So if you look here at the knots, right, there's 3 sides. So 3 units on this side over here, 4 units over here, right? And he knew that if you had a right angle triangle where one of the sides had a proportion of 3 to 4, you always had this remaining side, the longest one, which is called the hypotenuse, right, would be 5 units, or whatever those are. So you can imagine 3 meters by 4 meters would always give you 5 meters. And they had this figured out. And then what you could do is you could work out the math to sort of figure out if it's not a nice even number, right? So for instance, imagine if it was 15 over here and it'd be 20 over here, what would it be on that side? 25, yeah, you'd get 25, exactly. So they knew how to figure that out, right? So if you were, let's say, initiated into the guild or the sort of the those who build the stone cutting and the engineers, right? At some point, as part of your apprenticeship, they give you this string and they teach you this gimmick, and then from that you could build your engineering, and you were able to do things of this nature. But they hadn't really gone past the idea that it's just 3, 4, and 5. They hadn't cracked the code. So if you take a squared plus b squared, that's going to be equal to c squared. Now, once you've got the Pythagorean theorem, you've basically cracked the code now. You go from having these sort of ratios, right? And you've understood what the relation between the ratios are, because there's a ratio here between 3, 4, and 5. The way they hang together is you've ascended to a new level of abstraction that ranges over all of the right angle triangles, irrespective of their size. Now, it's called the Pythagorean theorem for a reason, because of Pythagoras. Pythagoras is a philosopher. Pythagoras is someone who cracked the code, and now we know him for that, but he also believed in all sorts of other weird stuff, by the way. He thought, for instance, he had followers and they couldn't eat beans, and then like if you made a fire, you had to turn out your fire, but then sort of turn the ashes counterclockwise a certain number of times. And he was this weirdo, very eccentric and extremely brilliant as well. And he's known for his mathematical discoveries, but he was actually a philosopher. And Pythagoras, who you know from school, right, had a specific view of metaphysics, a specific theory of reality. Here's Pythagoras working on strings here. Pythagoras had this idea, right, that the world is not exactly as it seems. So I want to show you an example that you can kind of relate to. If you have, let's say, a guitar, what happens here when you press your finger? What happens to the sound when I shorten the length? It's a higher pitch. Pythagoras played around with these strings, noted these qualities that we were hearing, right? So the pitch and the sounds that we're hearing, the qualia, if you will, right? And then he was like, wait a second, what's going on? My ears are going to hear a qualia, right? So if you have a music, right? Music is a qualia in the sense that we studied in philosophy of mind, right? There's a qualitative quality to them, like there's an aspect, there's a qualitative aspect to them when we hear music, right? But then he thought, wait a second, that's actually a product of a ratio. So if you think of the full length of the string, right? Here's the full length of the string. And if I pinch it and I shorten it to a certain length, right? You can imagine I shorten it to a certain length, I get a certain quality. So I meant Q1. And then if I cut it over here, I'm going to get another quality, call this quality number 2, right? But he thought, wait a second, what's going on is not so much that the qualities are themselves the important thing. What's really important are the ratios here that are being the fundamental source of my experience, right? These ratios. And so he had this idea that the world was made of ratios. The world was actually made of numbers, that the world that we experience, the world of qualia, the world that's given to us through our senses, the music that you hear with your ears, is actually a pale reflection of a world of numbers. So I told you I'd tell you a big story, and it would start from 4,000 years ago, starting from metaphysics, and we're going to end up in political philosophy. All right, let's watch this short video about Pythagoras and his theory of music and numbers.
Pythagoras was a Greek philosopher and mathematician. He lived around 570 to 495 BC and was known as one of the first pure mathematicians. His most famous discovery is the Pythagorean theorem, which tells us how the side lengths of a right angle triangle are related. Pythagoras was also known as the father of music and harmony. He discovered a relationship between the frequencies of sounds. Harmonious sounds, meaning pleasing or consistent sounds, had frequencies with whole number ratios between them. Dissonant sounds, which were unusual or harsh, had frequencies with non-whole number ratios. An octave is 8 notes apart, and if we look at the frequency of note A, it's 440 Hz. The note A, an octave above it, has a frequency of 880 Hz. You can see that an octave has a 2-to-1 ratio, since if you multiply 440 by 2, you get 880. Now if we look at a perfect fifth, taking the note A again with a frequency of 440 Hz, and the note E 5 notes above it, E has a frequency of approximately 659 Hz. Now the frequency of E is 3/2 times as much as the frequency of A. So a perfect fifth has a 3-to-2 ratio. Similarly, a perfect fourth has a ratio of 4-to-3, and major third chords have a ratio of 5-to-4. Pythagoras' discovery of harmony has had such an impact. Those 4 basic sounds form modern music and the harmonies and songs you listen to every day. As you can see, math is everywhere, and the discoveries made thousands of years ago have shaped the world today.
Now, Pythagoras had a student, a very famous student, whose name was Plato. I wouldn't say a student in the sense that he wasn't a part of his inner circle, but Plato was very interested in Pythagoras' ideas. He had learned them, and early on in his sort of philosophical career, as he's thinking through these ideas, was really drawn to Pythagoras' suggestion that the world is ultimately made of these numbers or ratios or mathematical structures, and everything we perceive, the qualia, if you will, that's not really real. So if I had to put an R for real, right, that's not real. The really real is this, right? That's what's really real. The world that we perceive is actually a pale comparison of this other world of numbers, of ratios, and so on. And Plato himself, although he sort of learned Pythagoras' ideas at a remove. He didn't have him as directly as a teacher. He did have a teacher whose name was Socrates. Here's Socrates. He was Plato's teacher, and he went around and he asked so many times. What's the one-word question that we ask in philosophy? I keep asking you that question. Why? Kyong, Weishama, why? He asked why so much that he made everyone around him look stupid, and they were so annoyed by him because he kept saying why. You can imagine, you grab your walking stick and you go around and you go talk to all the people who pretend to be wise, and you keep saying kyong, why, kyong. Every time they talk, right, you keep asking why, and eventually they can kind of tell they're not as wise as they thought they were. And so here he is being forced to drink poison. The society of his time, so he was in Athens, so the Athenians basically killed him. They forced him to drink poison because he was annoying everyone. They put him on trial, and he died. And his pupils, the people who really thought that he was actually onto something by asking all of these why questions, right? They were really saddened by this. So this is not obviously it's not a picture. This is a sort of a really bad Renaissance painting of the event. Plato is one of them. So one of these people over here, that can conceivably be Plato. Plato is a student of Socrates, and he saw his master die. And his master died just because he asked why. Basically, was the ultimate cancel culture, right? The ultimate censorship. He annoyed everyone with his questions, and they said, put him to death, right? And that freaked him out. So you can imagine Plato had freaked him out so much. I'm going to give you a quote from a book that I really like. This is the cover page of the book. It freaked out Plato so much that I think it affected all of his thinking from that moment on in philosophy. And we want our beliefs to mirror the structure of the universe, making our beliefs absolutely right and others frivolously or maliciously wrong. We want to know that our way of acting and thinking comes from our truest self, from what is highest and most divine in us, so as to make every alternative not just wrong, but a form of self-betrayal, a scorning of God or the world or humanity. I see the birth of metaphysics at the moment when Plato watched a jury of his peers condemn the greatest man alive, that's Socrates, to death. And then that jury went home to enjoy a hot meal, a good night's sleep, and a long, happy, self-satisfied life. Like the people who said to Socrates, it's time for you to die, you're bothering us. They condemned him to death, and then they just moved on, and they were fine with themselves, right? And Plato watched in horror as a jury of people decided to put him to death just for the crime of asking questions, right? And so Plato needed to know that even if the jurors and all of their friends felt completely justified in killing Socrates, even if they suffered neither punishment nor ignominy nor pangs of guilt, still they were wrong. This was wrong. What they did was wrong. Even if it was a democratic vote to put him to death, what they did was wrong. Maybe not by the standards of Athenian culture or of their own consciences. Yes, yet it must somehow be objectively true that they did wrong. This truth must be set into the very fabric of reality, whereas their merely human verdict was written in sand, and like all that transpires in this half-formed world of decay and ruin, will be washed away in the currents of time. So essentially what happened was, if you want to put this in psychological terms, Plato saw Socrates, his master, get killed. So here's Plato, right? And he's watching his master, and he's like, oh my God, he's getting killed by all of these idiots. So here are the idiots in question, right? Just a bunch of people who got together and voted him to death. It's like, imagine we have a vote, and everyone in Canada says, Damanjit's got to go. Damanjit just typed Y one too many times. Damanjit's annoying everyone. I'm sorry, for the good of Canada, you've got to die. Yeah, exactly. You know, and you can imagine if you have an older brother and older sister watching this happen, you're going to be like, screw this democratic nonsense. You can't just vote one person to death. I don't care if the vote is unanimous. Can you imagine? All of Canada says, put them and shit to death, right? It's like, and you're someone who loves you, who's close to you, is really, really upset. And you can think Plato was suffering in psychological terms, cognitive dissonance here. It's like, this is unfair. This is so grotesquely unfair. Something must be done. You know, like he felt this huge sense of injustice. And what he did, given his familiarity with Pythagoras, so this is Plato, was he went back to this idea over here that the real reality is like this. He said, okay, well, look, all of you idiots, right, who put Socrates to death, all of you idiots, you're over here. You're the idiots over here. You're in the mere world of appearances, the world that you live in, the world you like to call Canada or Athens, right, where you voted someone to death. You idiots are over here, right? The real world is over here. And we philosophers, we're the ones who study the deep structure of reality itself, right? And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make sure that you idiots are never in control again, that you don't know what you're talking about. You're all idiots. You don't even understand the Pythagorean theorem, right? You're just complete, like, your IQ's low. You just got together and you outnumbered us. That's all you did. You're just a large number of people, but you're brutes. And one brute and a million brutes is still a brute, right? And Plato, and I love the quote here from that book that I read you, his kind of movement, he was a young man at the time, right? He said, never again, right? This has to stop. And I have to put the truth of this injustice, I have to bake it into the very fabric of reality. So I like what he says here, right? No matter what they thought, even if they got away with it, they were wrong. Maybe not by the standards of Athenian culture or their own consciences. Yet it must somehow be objectively true that they did wrong. This truth must be set into the very fabric of reality. The truth of their wrongness, we got to bake that into the inner Tupperware container. I'm going to put that right inside, right? I'm going to make sure that this never happens again by going right down to the core and get the ultimate revenge. And so you can think of kind of like Batman when his parents died, right? Batman sees his parents murdered and he decides to be Batman. You can imagine kind of like Plato sees his parents murdered, kind of the equivalent. His teacher Socrates gets murdered, and then he's like, no, never again. Instead of dressing up like a bat, says, I'm going to go right down to the basement of reality itself, and I'm going to change things to make sure this never happens again, right? And how did he do that? Well, he did that by sitting down and then working out a philosophy, right? So it's like, I'm not going to turn Plato into Batman because, as you'll see from the story, he's not exactly a good guy in my story. But that's the idea. It made a big impact on him. This is a book. It's a dialogue. This is one of the most famous works in political philosophy, Plato's Republic. You have a bunch of people. It's a dialogue format. So it's a bunch of people talking. One of the characters is Socrates. And Socrates by then has been dead, by the way. So this is Plato making a kind of a fictional dialogue with his former master, kind of like he used to do when Socrates was alive. He'd have conversations with people on the street. And Plato watched those conversations. He was kind of there at most of them. And so after his master died, he kept kind of writing out more fictional dialogues. What if my master was still around? What would he say? What sort of conversations would he have? And he made up these fictional dialogues between his master, who kept asking, why, to all these other people. And he has this long dialogue where they talk about what should be the form of government that we have. What should our government look like? And that's what we find in Plato's Republic, a recipe book for what our government ought to look like. And it's called the Republic, but as we'll find out, it's not quite advocating for a republic as the form of government that we ought to have. It's a different story, right? And in the Republic, Plato argues that I've got it figured out. Here's what it should be. We philosophers, we should be in charge. We should be kings. And he argues for a notion of the philosopher king, right? Here's the quote. Until philosophers are kings, or the kings and princes of this world have the spirit and power of philosophy, cities will never rest from their evils. So his solution was, remember the idea, right? Going back a bit, and he sort of developed this idea of the philosopher king. What if philosophers were kings? Since we philosophers are really smart, see, we understand the Pythagoras theorem, we take a lot of time to study, like think of what you're doing when you do argument diagramming. You're studying structures, right? Logical relations. And if you keep training yourself at that, you do get smarter. Well, take the smartest among us and make that person king. Have the philosophers be in charge of society. Don't put the idiots, the ordinary persons, in charge. Make the philosopher in charge of society, because the idiots are concerned with the appearance of things, not their real nature. The idiots are concerned with things like music, and Plato hated music. Oh my God, he hated music, right? Because he thought that the world that we see, that's a world of falsehoods, right? The real world is this unchanging world of mathematical structures and logic, and the philosophers study that, right? So let's put them in charge. Let's make philosophers king. So in this book, the most famous book by Plato called The Republic, what you have is the idea that a philosopher should be in charge. And you get the development of this idea of the philosopher king. And I like this little drawing. It's Plato sitting there in his throne. And that, by the way, is the letter phi from the Greek, right? Phi is the first letter of philosophy, phi, so for philosopher. So that's the logo, if you will. Kind of looks like the Green Lantern logo, right? He's the philosopher and he's the king. And that's the owl of Minerva. That's supposed to represent wisdom, just so you know a little bit of the iconography or mythology here in the image, right? So that's Plato himself. And look at him. He's all serious and he's sitting in his throne. Now, he just basically said, if I was in charge, this wouldn't have happened, right? And I'm going to sort of argue that we should have a philosopher king that's in charge. And that's his main idea. So what you end up with, even if it's called a republic, in a republic, people are democratically elected, right? It's a variation on democracy. So they vote, for instance, right? This is not what Plato is interested in at all. Because look, why not? This is what voted Socrates to death. So this system here, this political system of a democracy, Plato says, never again. That's idiotic, because we could all vote for Demenjit to die. Think about it. If majority vote is what holds the power, and if we hold a vote and you can prove that 97% of Canadians want Demenjit to die, then Demenjit's got to go. If we deem that it's on our best interest as Canadians to have Demenjit go, then out comes the guillotine and we can accomplish anything we want. And he thought there's no real reason to think that popular vote tracks truth. Why should we expect that a bunch of idiots, if they get together, are more than idiots? They're still idiotic. They can reach an idiotic conclusion. And so he thought this is a bad system. He didn't think this was a good system either, right? This is a bad system. He certainly wasn't an anarchist, right? Let anything go and so on. The view that he's going to end up advocating for is actually going to be a variation on something like this: a dictatorship or a monarchy, right? The idea of a philosopher king kind of gives you already, here's the crown on the king, right? The idea, but it's not normally when you have a king, it's based on lineage. Like you have to be of the right bloodline. For Plato, it's going to be about who's the smartest, and you put those in charge. And then the dictatorship element is, yeah, you're allowed to use force. So there's a gun here, right? And so provided that he says you're smart and you're the philosopher, you get to use the gun, right? Because you're going to use it benevolently. Presumably, you'll have enough wisdom that you'll use it wisely. And that's going to be the political system that he's going to defend. And his views were really, really influential. And as we'll see, in some way, even though they may seem implausible to you, because once you learn their genealogy, remember the genealogy, right? They've got some, they're still around. Arnav, I feel like Plato's argument might have a lot of counter arguments, right? Well, Arnav, you're going to see some today, because I'm only setting up Plato because I'm going to turn around and criticize all of this. So yeah, Arnav, you just stay tuned, my friend. We're not going to keep, we're studying Plato precisely because what we're going to read is going to be basically a criticism of Plato. This is all a setup for our reading today. And so remember the main idea, right? And if you haven't read any Plato, right, I've created a file. I'm going to make it available on Moodle, a bunch of quotes from Plato's books. So here's a quote from the Republic, another quote from the Republic, and it tells you where to locate them. So this is a sort of scholarly reference, right? And so we should have a dictatorship. So don't take it from me. If you want to read the primary source material, you want to read excerpts from the Republic, I've given you a 4-page document, right? And here's some of the ideas. Democracy is a bad idea. Government should use propaganda. Society should be organized like a military. We need a military/political elite. The government should be in charge of human breeding. We should kill inferior and defective children. Procreation and child rearing should be directed by the state, and there should be castes. So these are the big ideas that you get in the Republic. And you might be thinking, oh my God. So if you want to check this out for yourself, don't take my word for it. What I've done is I've constructed a document with basically just 4 pages instead of having you read hundreds and hundreds of pages from the Republic. You can just go straight to those passages to see that I'm not making this stuff up if you're interested, right? Just so that we know that this is really based in actual scholarship and the real ideas of Plato. I'm going to show you a video about his idea of the philosopher king. It's just 2 minutes. Have a look at this video. Really fun and really accurate.
Plato's philosopher kings. If you were out at sea in a ship, would you A, take a vote on how to steer the ship, or B, try and find out if there was someone on board who knew how to do it? If you chose B, then presumably you agree that expertise is useful in these situations. You don't want amateurs taking guesses when it's a matter of life and death. Far better to have someone who can navigate you back to port, avoiding the rocks. Well, what about when steering the great ship of state? Taking a vote on which way to go would be far less effective than finding someone who knew what they were doing to be your leader. That's what Plato argued in Book 6 of his Republic. He had a very low view of democracy as a process for deciding what to do. Even voting in a leader would be risky because voters are easily swayed by irrelevant features, such as a candidate's looks. They don't realize that ruling is a skill, just like navigation. The experts Plato wanted at the helm of a ship of state were, surprisingly, specially trained philosophers, philosopher kings or philosopher queens, chosen because they were incorruptible and had a deeper knowledge of reality than other people, an idea that only a philosopher could have come up with.
So that's the main idea, right? We should put philosophers in charge. Why? Because philosophers have access to this realm. This is not a realm that you can see. It's not a realm that you can hear. Like your ears, for instance, will hear the qualia of the music on the guitar, but your ears don't listen to the ratio. Your ears listen to the qualia. What has access to the ratio? Not your eyes, not your ears, not your sense of touch, not your sense of smell, not your sense of taste, but rather your intellect. It is your mind. Your mind is the perceptual organ for ratios. Your mind is the thing that penetrates into the deep structure of reality and sees its mathematical structure. And that's going to have big consequences. So for instance, atop of his school, so Plato had a school, and at the top of his school, it's called the Academy. We still call university academia or the academy, right? His school was called the Academy. And at the top of the door, it said, "He who is without mathematics shall not enter." So you had to be, he said, yeah, you need to know mathematics and geometry to come to his school. So he didn't want anyone studying philosophy if they couldn't do logic. That's like me saying, I'm not going to teach you philosophy until you pass my introductory, intermediate, and advanced logic courses, which sometimes in some moods I feel like doing. I can see where Plato was coming from. And so the reason why he wanted everyone to have some acquaintance with mathematics is because he thought, look, this is the real reality. He thought that when you do philosophy, what you do is you start attaining this kind of the idea of the forms of things. So here is a specific cat, for instance, that has a name, and here's another specific cat. It's a pet of someone. Here's a specific cat. Notice that all the cats you'll ever see, so if you look at this ground level here, right, all of the cats that you'll ever see with your eyeballs and touch with your hands and perceive with your senses, they're all different from one another. No two cats are alike. So here there's a cat that's black, here there's a cat that's white, there's the one that's dotted, right? But all cats have something in common, even if they're all different, right? They all kind of share this general form of the cat. They all have this kind of shared cathood. There's these basic features that all cats have to share. And what we do when we abstract out those features is we ascend to the world of the ideal or perfect cat. And philosophy and abstract thinking consists precisely in this passage from the imperfect things that our senses give us to the perfect things that our intellect can grasp. So for instance, if you see here, you can imagine if you have, if I give you 3 apples, right? 3 apples over here, and I give you 3 bananas. So this is 3 bananas, 1 banana, 2 bananas, 3 bananas. What they have in common, right, is 3. So 3 apples, right? You can kind of reach, if you will, a higher level of abstraction with your mind that lets you pull out the number, if you will. And the number 3, unlike the apples and the bananas, apples and bananas rot. Will the number 3 ever rot or die? Can the number 3 ever expire? No, exactly. If I take, so for instance, if I put the number 3 over here, right, that's not actually the number 3. That's just red on the screen. Can I destroy the number 3 itself? Can I just decide to destroy the number 3? Yes or no? Like, imagine I do this. Am I destroying the number 3? Like, oh, you can't use it in math anymore? Clearly, right? I can't. Right? You can steal a sign of the number 6. So imagine, for instance, there's a price tag on something. You can take that, you can burn it, you can steal it, whatever. It can oxidize, but the number itself is permanent. It's unchanging. 6 is what it is, and it will remain what it is all the time, right? And the Pythagorean theorem, so remember the Pythagorean theorem? That's never going to change. It's what it's going to be. And it's the same wherever you are on the earth. If you're in India, if you're in China, if you're in the South Pole, if you're on Mars, the Pythagorean theorem holds, right? A squared, oh, that's a really fat marker. B squared, that's way too fat. We can't see anything, but you get the idea, right? That ratio is always going to be the same. So when you access where you're a mathematician, right, or a philosopher, and you've done a lot of training, what you do when you do the training is you ascend to this other level, right? You go from the world of imperfections to the world of perfection, the world of change to the world of the unchanging. And he thought that that's what philosophers do. And he had this great way of explaining it in the Republic. He has a story at some point called The Allegory of the Cave. I'm going to share with you a video about that. But in the Republic by Plato, which is, as I said, one of the most influential books in political philosophy, you have a full philosophical story for a form of government, and in there, there's the following story. Watch this story.
Short-lived flicker of flame. 2,400 years ago, one of history's most famous thinkers said life is like being chained up in a cave, forced to watch shadows flitting across a stone wall. Pretty cheery, right? That's actually what Plato suggested in his Allegory of the Cave, found in Book 7 of the Republic, in which the Greek philosopher envisioned the ideal society by examining concepts like justice, truth, and beauty. In the allegory, a group of prisoners have been confined in a cavern since birth with no knowledge of the outside world. They are chained facing a wall, unable to turn their heads, while a fire behind them gives off a faint light. Occasionally, people pass by the fire carrying figures of animals and other objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners name and classify these illusions, believing they're perceiving actual entities. Suddenly, one prisoner is freed and brought outside for the first time. The sunlight hurts his eyes, and he finds the new environment disorienting. When told that the things around him are real, while the shadows were mere reflections, he cannot believe it. The shadows appeared much clearer to him, but gradually his eyes adjust until he can look at reflections in the water, at objects directly, and finally at the sun, whose light is the ultimate source of everything he has seen. The prisoner returns to the cave to share his discovery, but he is no longer used to the darkness and has a hard time seeing the shadows on the wall. The other prisoners think the journey has made him stupid and blind, and violently resist any attempts to free them. Plato introduces this passage as an analogy of what it's like to be a philosopher trying to educate the public. Most people are not just comfortable in their ignorance, but hostile to anyone who points it out. In fact, the real-life Socrates was sentenced to death by the Athenian government for disrupting the social order, and his student Plato spends much of the Republic disparaging Athenian democracy, while promoting rule by philosopher kings. With the cave parable, Plato may be arguing that the masses are too stubborn and ignorant to govern themselves.
What you do when you get out of the cave essentially is you ascend to this level where you see the real things. These are what we see here at the bottom, right? The particular things that we see with our perceptual organs. These are the shadows. The real thing is the shared form, right? And by doing philosophy and thinking more and more abstractly, you get more and more comfortable with accessing these forms. And then eventually you realize that this is where the truth is. This is where reality is. This is all wrong, right? This is not what you should base yourself on. You should base yourself on this stuff, right? Because these are just kind of shadows of these other things. What's really real is these unchanging abstract patterns that exist forever and that the philosopher studies, right? So when you exit the cave, essentially, when you do philosophy, you see the light, right? You've reached a new level of knowledge, and then you leave behind the ignorant people behind you, because the people who haven't taken philosophy, who haven't studied logic, who haven't studied mathematics, they still are interested in what their senses are telling them. They're still bound to the concrete level of the particular cats, of the particular things in this world, of the qualia they hear with their ears. They haven't ascended to this perfect, permanent realm, right, that you've ascended through study. And when you reach that, then Plato says you're fit to be king, right? And when you reach this kind of the sun, if you will, the source of all things, it's this, the concept to end all concepts. The most abstract concept you could reach is this. It's the good, which breaks down as truth, beauty, and justice, or moral goodness, right? So the most abstract idea you could reach as you study philosophy, as you keep abstracting out and leaving out details, and abstracting out and leaving out details, and generalizing, you're going to reach eventually the topmost concept, the concept that ranges over all of them, which is this: truth, beauty, and justice, right? And all of that comes as a clump for Plato. And interestingly, notice what's happening here. Truth, right, is a epistemological concept. Beauty is an aesthetic concept, and justice is an ethical concept and a political concept, a normative concept. So what you end up with is, truth here is a descriptive concept, and here you have normative concepts, and you have, remember the distinction between descriptive and normative. All of that gets clumped together into one thing, the normative and the descriptive. You get it all in one go. So the ultimate culmination of your study in philosophy is that you have an understanding of these key concepts. And when you have that, then he says you're fit to rule. Then you can be the philosopher king. Then you can hold the gun. So I love this quote in particular because it captures everything we've just said so far. Plato had one big idea from which everything else derived. He fundamentally defined reality as that which is permanent and unchanging. So defined reality as that which is permanent and unchanging. So essentially doing metaphysics here. What do we put in the box? What's the innermost Tupperware container? That which is permanent and unchanging. Only ideas are permanent and unchanging, and anything material deteriorates and decays. So for Plato, this idea of permanence and unchanging is really the hallmark of the real. It's what he really wants to value in his metaphysics box. And that's going to cause some problems. Why? Well, for instance, if you're Plato, and given everything I've just said, are you ready for change? Yes or no? If you're Plato, you like change? Yes or no? Given everything we've just said so far. You got it, right? So you would tick this box over here. That would be Plato holding the pen right here. Change is something that happens over here for the idiots, right? This is unchanging. So U for unchanging, C for change. Stuff in the cave changes, right? But the unchanging forms, they're the real reality, right? Just like the numbers are never going to change. Remember the idea. This is never going to change. You can kill this cat. It eventually dies. This cat eventually dies. New cats come into being. This one will eventually die. But what distinguishes all cats together, that's the real reality. That's never going to change. That's going to create some problems for us. Now we're going to start thinking a little bit more, turning around and thinking a little more critically about Plato, because this is all a setup. Remember not last week, but a couple weeks ago when we did Popper, remember we talked about falsification. And when we talked about Popper and philosophy of science, we said, what should philosophy take away from this account? And we said that in philosophy, you should always state the conditions under which you would be prepared to admit that you are wrong. Now, Plato thinks that if you've studied enough philosophy, you've figured it out. You figured it all out. In fact, you figured it out so much that you get to be a philosopher king who tells others what to do, even using force. And so this comes in conflict with the suggestion that we had a few weeks ago that you should always state the conditions under which you're prepared to admit that you're wrong. And he's not a fan of change. And likewise, he's not a fan of admitting that he would be wrong. Once you've reached this kind of the good, right? Truth, beauty, and justice. You've studied so much, right? If you're over here, if you haven't studied enough and you're not smart enough yet, maybe you should stand ready to change your mind. But when you're the philosopher king, and let me put a crown on this person, you're the philosopher king and you've reached the unchanging forms, then you should not change your mind. Are you ready for change? Well, it'd be like, have you properly studied philosophy? Are you super smart? If you are, right, then you don't need to change. And if you're an idiot, which he probably would regard you as an idiot, right, say, yeah, you go change your mind, you student, because you're not there yet. And so we have a conflict here, where we have a genuine conflict. I mean, think about now, let's go back to political issues. Here's a bunch of political issues. Here's some real serious issues that we confront day to day. And remember, everyone has to have a philosophy. The only choice is whether it's an explicit one or an implicit one, but everyone has one. How are we going to deal with these problems is going to be reflective of our implicit philosophy. These are all problems: poverty, homelessness, public health, climate change, pollution, euthanasia, social inequality, domestic, a bunch of stuff, right? And you can think of these are collective problems. These are social problems. These are problems that happen at a collective scale, a societal scale. They clearly belong to the fourth Tupperware container, right? The political philosophy stuff. So how are we going to deal with this stuff? And you have two conflicting approaches here. So here's the public policy cycle. It starts off with this. So you've got problem identification as phase one. So there's a problem. I've just listed a ton. So you've seen all these little icons, right? There's a problem. You pick one, right? So that's the problem identification. And then if it's a problem, it's a genuine problem, right? So you want to try to fix it. And then policy formulation. You basically venture a hypothesis on how you might want to try to solve this problem. Then you kind of pitch it and adopt it. And, you sort of present it to government. It gets adopted, because there's different policies you might formulate. Not all of the policies you formulate will end up being adopted, only some of them. So here I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 candidates, and only 2 end up being adopted, right? So there's a deliberative process that happens in a properly structured government where people generate different hypotheses, but not all of them get adopted, partly because of budget and partly because sometimes they're mutually conflicting, right? And then there's policy implementation. Okay, so we've adopted these policies. Now we have to actually implement them. And then the cycle is precisely a cycle because once we implement them, they have, an effect on the world, and then we can evaluate them. Policy evaluation is a crucial step in this process. Once you've got a policy that you've implemented, right? So that comes after implementation. You can ask yourself, did it work? And that's a falsifiable claim. So, okay, so you pick a problem, whatever it is, and you say, that's a problem, I want to fix it. And then you propose a fix, right? And then your fix gets adopted, and you get to here, and then it gets done, and so on. But the question is, did it actually work, right? Was it any good? And this is part of the process. It's a crucial, look at this arrow here, it's a crucial segment of it. And if you're going to actually do this phase of the public policy cycle, honestly, you have to stand ready to admit that you were wrong. And if you were wrong and the policy didn't work out as well as you thought, then you re-enter the loop. You've got another problem, precisely now probably a better formulated, right, understanding of your problem now, because in light of what you've done, you've gone around the circle at least once, right? So now you've learned something about the situation. Presumably now you have better knowledge, and then you redo the cycle again. Now you've got a better understanding of the problem. You formulate new policies, so you generate different hypotheses now on what might solve the problem. And then you've already said, let's say this one doesn't work, so you're going to try some other ones. One of them gets adopted, it gets implemented, and then once it's implemented, then you have the merit of being able to see in the world whether or not it worked. And the crucial Popperian phase, the very Popper-like moment, is when you stand ready, when you evaluate to admit that you were wrong. Like the approach that I teach and the approach that a good policymaker ought to be is, as these people are around the table talking, each one of them stands ready to change their mind. Like if you're not receptive to what she's saying, if this guy over here, no matter what she says, is not changing his mind, what's the point? Why are we getting together to talk about these problems, to figure stuff out? And what we're going to be looking at today is the influence of Plato. And it's going to connect well with also the stuff that we did in ethics last week. Remember when we talked about abortion, the takeaway message was this, that well-meaning people can have reasonable disagreements about what is right. Here's a bunch of people trying to figure out what to do about a certain issue. And all of these people at the table, even if they disagree, this person champions proposal A, this person champions proposal B, this other person's in favor of proposal C, maybe only one of them can be the case. You can't have A, B, and C all true at the same time. But all of these people are trying to figure out stuff. They're trying to get to the truth. And well-meaning people can have reasonable disagreements about what is right, about what to do. because we sometimes have to decide between conflicting principles that are each acceptable on their own. We saw this when we looked at the case of whether or not to fire Rajan, because we sometimes agree on a principle, but we disagree about the particular case, how the particular case should be understood. That's the case, for instance, with abortion, whether or not a fetus is alive. No one advocates killing. And even when a case is clear and there's only one principle to apply, it's often not obvious what action to take. So a cavalier attitude is misplaced. Now, what we have in Plato is sort of the complete opposite of that. Here's one approach to dealing with complicated policy issues. The world is divided into two groups, us and them. Us, we're the good guys. Them, they're the bad guys. And the game is as follows. Make sure you're us and then get rid of them. Imagine if you dealt with the world along those lines. If this image right now was your way of sorting out the complicated problems of the world, all the problems we saw a moment ago with all those little icons, imagine what would happen if you saw the world that way. Imagine, moreover, if you saw the following. You thought, we're the chosen ones. So here's the chosen ones, right? And this is a ceremony where you put some oil on someone's head. This is an ancient ceremony for saying that you're the chosen ones, right? So this is a wise old person saying, okay, you're the elite, you're part of the chosen, right? And you pour some oil. This is called anointing. Anointing is this, and you have this in different cultures, right? It's a way of initiation, if you will, into the elite. So we're the chosen ones, and we're on this side, right? So we're us. That's us, the good guys. We're the good guys. And here I'm being inducted into the good guys. I'm part of the group, right? And we're going to go fight some bad guys. And because why am I in the group? Well, because I've accessed the forms. I know the unchanging truths, unchanging, right? Never, don't change your mind. These are never going to change. No one's ever going to revise the Pythagorean theorem. No amount of evidence is ever going to make that change. So I'm in the realm of the unchanging. I've exited the cave, right? I'm over here. Right, I see the sun. You're seeing all of you. You're not smart enough, right? You students, what the hell do you know? You're looking at the shadows. I'm looking at the sun and the real thing, right? Because look, I've studied a lot. I've got this all figured out. And then if you had this approach to public policy issues, then well, you say, well, look, calm down, right? Because we're the chosen ones. We got this all figured out. We're smarter than all of y'all. We've got access to, we've got our eye on the truth, the beauty and justice. We've got it all figured out. And, you can't go wrong when you love others. So our intent is good. So who the hell cares what the consequences are? So no matter what public policy we make, everything's going to be fine because our intentions are noble. And so we can go ahead and we can make whatever rules and regulations we want now. We have unlimited power. We can rule over everybody else, right? Because we're the elite. We have access to the truth. And our intentions are good, right? And we're going to go after the bad guys because we're the good guys. Well, if you did that, you can see all of the Platonic, that means Plato, right? All of the ideas of Plato are kind of working themselves out into an approach to how you should govern, right? How you should deal with political philosophy, how you should run a government. When we start thinking about how best to organize ourselves as a society, we engage in what is known as political philosophy. Human-made institutions play a significant role in our lives. Political philosophers want to know what, if anything, justifies the existence and shape of such social institutions, like governments, laws, etc. Our reading by Thomas Sowell argues that political visions about how things should be become dangerously tyrannical when they're isolated from facts about how things are. His main claim is that it is not because a policy is formulated with good intentions that it will achieve good results. The human realm is far more complex than that. When one implements a policy, people alter their behavior, which changes the situation that one initially used to craft the policy. For instance, if you're working hard to get a good grade, and I suddenly guarantee you a good grade, you might stop working as hard. Social facts like these are tricky, but they're still facts. Indeed, facts are central to Sowell's political philosophy. This is because, as he points out in his book, Vision of the Anointed, for every expert, there's an equal and opposite expert. But for every fact, there's not necessarily an equal and opposite fact. Sowell's argument thus proceeds from a powerful premise. We are capable of being mistaken. And you can see how that's very Popper-like. This applies to everyone, no matter how smart or how moral they think they are. One consequence of this ability to make errors is that we must stand ready to change our minds, in part or in whole, whenever things don't work out as planned. As Sowell, who's written more than 30 books, once said, "It takes considerable knowledge just to realize the extent of your own ignorance." Ordinarily, when something doesn't work, we simply go back to the drawing board and change our approach. In politics, however, feelings seem more important than facts. Indeed, Sowell uses examples from recent history to show that those in charge of formulating and implementing social policies often believe that their noble intent exempts them from making corrections when the world fails to comply with their aims. Facts are cherry-picked to conform what one already believes. Anything or anyone that would force one to revise what one believes is ignored, called names, or explained away. Sowell calls the cluster of ideals and assumptions espoused by the ruling political class the vision of the anointed. The idea of being anointed, which comes from religion, means to be chosen from a higher purpose, which makes one holy and above other people. So remember, anointed was a little oil on the head. Synonyms of anointed could include the chosen ones, the ruling elites, and or those who know better than the rest of us. Those who disagree with the worldview and political program of the anointed are referred to by Sowell as the benighted, which means ignorant and morally inferior. Synonyms of benighted could include the unenlightened, the masses of deplorables, and or those who need to be shown the way. As is apparent in the reading, Sowell does not believe that the anointed are anointed or that the benighted are benighted. The world does not divide neatly into good guys and bad guys. The vocabulary used by Sowell suggests that, in a secular society, politics can sometimes become a substitute for religion. People need crusades to engage in, sinners to denounce, feel-good buzzwords to repeat, forbidden words not to utter, and so on. Hence, current political debates may be a cover for yearnings that religious zeal used to satisfy. However, just as in religion, there's a real risk of dogmatism, that's closed-mindedness, whenever one shuts down dialogue and refuses to accept the possibility of being wrong. No amount of conviction or cultural dominance will spare one from the possibility of being mistaken. Policies are hypotheses that can be empirically tested and thus potentially falsified. But as Sowell argues near the end of our reading, such calm appeals to reason and evidence may be futile in the political domain because reason and evidence risk jeopardizing the anointed sense of self, which derives in large part from their militant outlook. It feels good to believe that one is saving the world, even if that belief has no basis in fact. The vision of the anointed, self-congratulation as the basis for social policies. Human beings have been making mistakes and committing sins as long as there have been human beings. The great catastrophes of history have usually involved much more than that. Typically, there has been an additional and crucial ingredient, some method by which feedback from reality has been prevented, so that a dangerous course of action could be blindly continued to a fatal conclusion. Today, the prevailing social vision is dangerously close to sealing itself off from any discordant feedback from reality. Even when issues of public policy are discussed in the outward form of an argument, often the conclusions reached are predetermined. The focus here will be on the one particular vision, the vision prevailing among the intellectual and political elite of our time. What is important about that vision are not only its particular assumptions and corollaries, but also the fact that it is a prevailing vision, which means that its assumptions are so much taken for granted by so many people that neither those assumptions nor their corollaries are generally confronted with demands for empirical evidence. What the prevailing vision of our time emphatically does offer is a special state of grace for those who believe in it. Those who accept this vision are deemed to be not merely factually correct, but morally on a higher plane. Put differently, those who disagree with the prevailing vision are seen as being not merely in error, but in sin. For those who have this vision of the world, the anointed and the benighted do not argue on the same moral plane or play by the same cold rules of logic and evidence. The benighted are to be made aware, to have their consciousness raised, and the wistful hope is held out that they will grow. Should the benighted prove recalcitrant, however, then their mean-spiritedness must be fought and the real reasons behind their arguments and actions exposed. The contemporary anointed and those who follow them make much of their compassion for the less fortunate, their concern for the environment, their being anti-war, for example, as if these were characteristics which distinguish them from people with opposite views on public policy. The very idea that such an opponent of the prevailing vision has just as much compassion for the poor and the disadvantaged, that he is just as much appalled by pollution or as horrified by the sufferings and slaughter imposed by war on millions of innocent men, women, and children. Such an idea would mean that opposing arguments on social policy were arguments about methods, probabilities, and empirical evidence, with compassion, caring, and the like being common features on both sides, thus canceling out and disappearing from the debate. That clearly is not the vision of the anointed. The vision of the anointed is not simply a vision of the world and its functioning in a causal sense, but it is also a vision of themselves and of their moral role in that world. Problems exist because others are not as wise or as virtuous as the anointed. Despite the great variety of issues in a series of crusading movements among the intelligentsia during the 20th century, several key elements have been common to most of them. 1. Assertions of a great danger to the whole of society, a danger to which the masses of people are oblivious. 2. An urgent need for action to avert impending catastrophe. 3. A need for government to drastically curtail the dangerous behavior of the many in response to the prescient conclusions of the few. 4. A disdainful dismissal of arguments to the contrary as either uninformed, irresponsible, or motivated by unworthy purposes. This vision so permeates the media and academia and has made such major inroads that many students grow to adulthood unaware that there's any other way of looking at things. All social theories being imperfect, the harm done by their imperfections depends not only on how far they differ from reality, but also on how readily they adjust to evidence to come back into line with the facts. One theory may be more plausible or even more sound than another, but if it is also more dogmatic, that means it doesn't change when the policy cycle goes around, then that can make it far more dangerous than a theory that is not initially as close to the truth, but which is more capable of adjusting to feedback from the real world. The prevailing vision of our time, the vision of the anointed, has shown an extraordinary ability to defy evidence. A very distinct pattern has emerged repeatedly when policies favored by the anointed turn out to fail. This pattern typically has 4 stages. Stage 1, the crisis. Some situation exists whose negative aspects the anointed propose to eliminate. Such a situation is routinely characterized as a crisis, even though all human situations have negative aspects, and even though evidence is seldom asked or given to show how the situation at hand is either uniquely bad or threatening to get worse. Sometimes the situation described as a crisis has in fact already been getting better for years. Stage 2, the solution. Policies to end the crisis are advocated by the anointed, who say that these policies will lead to beneficial result A. Critics say that these policies will lead to detrimental result Z. The anointed dismiss these later claims by critics as absurd and simplistic, if not dishonest. Stage 3, the results. The policies are instituted and lead to detrimental result Z. The response? Those who attribute detrimental result Z to the policies instituted are dismissed as simplistic for ignoring the quote-unquote complexities involved, as many factors went into determining the outcome. The burden of proof is put on the critics to demonstrate to a certainty that these policies alone were the only possible course of the worsening that occurred. No burden of proof whatever is put on those who had so confidently predicted improvement. Indeed, it's often asserted that things would have been even worse were it not for the wonderful programs that mitigated the inevitable damage from other factors. Examples of this pattern are too abundant. The first and most general involves the set of social welfare policies called the War on Poverty. Governmental policies designed to alleviate deprivations of the poor go back much further and, of course, reach far beyond the boundaries of the United States. What was different about this particular set of social programs, first proposed to Congress during the Kennedy administration and later enacted into law during the Johnson administration, was that its stated purpose was a reduction of dependency, not simply the provision of more material goods to the poor. John F. Kennedy stated that the purpose of the War on Poverty to help our less fortunate citizens to help themselves. He said, "We must find ways of returning far more of our dependent people to independence." The whole point of currently increased federal spending on this effort was to strengthen and broaden the rehabilitative and preventive services so that long-run savings in government spending were expected from a subsequent decline in dependency. "Give a hand, not a handout" was the slogan of the War on Poverty. A diametrically opposite set of beliefs and predictions came from critics of the War on Poverty proposals. Senator Barry Goldwater predicted that these programs would encourage poverty by encouraging more and more people to move into the ranks of those being taken care of by the government. Nor did he expect expanded social programs to lead to a more harmonious society, for he saw their underlying philosophy as an attempt to divide Americans along class lines, to pigeonhole people and make hyphenated Americans. The assumption that initial increases in government spending on social programs would lead to reduced spending in later years as dependency declined was likewise disputed by opponents who said we can expect the price tag to increase geometrically as the years go on. Now, from an analytical standpoint, the issues were virtually ideal for testing. Two conflicting sets of beliefs led logically to opposite conclusions, stated in terms that could be tested empirically. Almost never, however, were such empirical tests made. The views expressed in the vision of the Anointed became regarded as self-evident. A re-examination of that vision, as it applied to the War on Poverty, shows that it went through the 4 stages already described. Stage 1, the crisis. Given that the purpose of the War on Poverty was to reduce dependency, the question is, how much dependency was there at the time, and was it increasing or decreasing before the new policies were instituted? In short, what was the crisis for which the Anointed were proposing a solution? As of the time the War on Poverty program began, the number of people who lived below the official poverty line had been declining continuously since 1960 and was only about half of what it had been in 1950. On the more fundamental issue of dependency, the situation was even more clearly improving. The proportion of people whose earnings put them below the poverty level without counting government benefits declined by about 1/3 from 1950 to 1965. In short, dependency on government transfers as a means of warding off poverty was declining when the War on Poverty began. Stage 2, the solution. The Economic Opportunity Act was passed in 1964, creating the Office of Economic Opportunity, the War on Poverty agency. As an historian of poverty programs put it, Congress was quick to buy a program that might help welfare wither away. The Council of Economic Advisors declared, "Conquest of poverty is well within our power." Stage 3, results. The percentage of people dependent upon the federal government to keep above the poverty line increased. Although the number of such dependent people had been declining for more than a decade before the War on Poverty programs began, this downward trend now reversed itself and began rising within a few years after that program got underway. Official poverty continued to its decline for some time as massive federal outlays lifted many people above the official poverty line, but not out of dependency, the original goal. Eventually, however, even official poverty began to rise, so that a larger number of people were in poverty in 1992 than were in poverty in 1964 when the War on Poverty began. Despite initial claims that various government services would lead to reduced federal outlays on federal welfare programs as more and more people became self-sufficient, the very opposite happened. The fact that the actual course of events followed a pattern diametrically the opposite of what was assumed and proclaimed by those with the vision of the Anointed made not the slightest dent in the policies they advocated or in the assumptions behind those policies. In this respect, as in others, the vision of the Anointed had achieved a sacrosanct status, hermetically sealed off from the contaminating influence of facts. Stage 4, the response. The failure of the war on poverty to achieve its goal of reducing dependency, and in fact an increasing dependency as these policies went into effect, brought no acknowledgement of failure. The goal was instead redefined as reducing poverty by transferring resources. A member of President Johnson's cabinet suggested yet another criterion of success. Ask the 11 million students who have received loans for their college education whether the Higher Education Act failed. Similar questions were suggested for those who used a wide range of other government programs. In short, the test for whether the program was good for the country as a whole was whether those who personally benefited from it found it beneficial. Related to the moral redemption of the uncaring masses was the excitement and inspiration of the elite. At a 20th anniversary commemoration of the Johnson administration's social programs, another former aide to President Johnson referred to the vision that excited and inspired the nation. Mrs. Johnson spoke of the sense of caring and the exhilaration of her husband's efforts. Finally, it was asserted that things would have been even worse were it not for these programs. There's no possible reply to these heads I win and tails you lose assertions, except to note that they would justify any policy on any subject, anywhere, regardless of its empirically observed consequences. No matter what happens, the vision of the Anointed always succeeds, if not by the original criteria, then by criteria extemporized later, and if not by empirical criteria, then by criteria sufficiently subjective to escape even the possibility of refutation. Scientific evidence comes from systematically determining in advance what a particular empirical observations would be seen if one theory were correct compared to what would be seen if an alternative theory were correct. Only after this careful and painstaking analysis has been completed can a search begin for facts that will differentiate between the competing theories. Seldom is this approach used by those who believe in the vision of the Anointed. More typically, they look through statistics until they find some numbers that fit their preconceptions and then cry, "Ha-ha!" Others with different views can, of course, do the same thing, but only those with the prevailing views are likely to be taken seriously when using such shaky reasoning. Perhaps the purest examples of the problems of the ha-ha approach are sets of statistics which themselves contain numbers completely at odds with the conclusions drawn from other numbers in the same set. A widely reported study from the National Center for Health Statistics showed that 1. Black pregnant women in the United States receive prenatal care less often than white pregnant women, and that 2. Infant mortality rates among blacks were substantially higher than among whites. Ha-ha reactions in the media were immediate, vehement, and widespread. It was automatically assumed that the first fact was the cause of the second, that this showed American society's neglect of its minorities, if not outright racism, and that what was needed was more governmental spending on prenatal care. According to a New York Times editorial, 1/4 of the infant deaths in the United States were easily preventable and were primarily attributable to their mother's lack of prenatal care. What was needed was, quote, an increase in federal spending on prenatal care. The Washington Post likewise urged legislation to provide vital assistance to pregnant women who cannot afford normal medical care. In the very same report that showed racial disparities in infant mortality, indeed, on the very same page, statistics show that 1. Mexican Americans received even less prenatal care than blacks, and the 2. Infant mortality rates among Mexican Americans were no higher than among whites. Had anyone been seriously interested in testing an hypothesis, the conclusion would have been that something other than prenatal care must have been responsible for intergroup differences in infant mortality. That conclusion would have been further buttressed by data on infant mortality rates for Americans of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino ancestry, all of whom received less prenatal care than whites and yet had lower infant mortality rates than whites. But of course, no one with the vision of the Anointed was looking for any such data, so there was no ha-ha. In short, numbers are accepted as evidence when they agree with the preconceptions, but not when they don't. The Anointed are free to believe that the unhappiness they observe and the anomalies they encounter are due to the public's not being as wise or as virtuous as themselves. Both their conceptions of social issues and the vocabulary in which they discuss them are pervaded by notions of protecting this group and liberating that one. In both cases, obviously from the benighted or malign actions of other people. It is a world of victims, villains, and rescuers, with the Anointed cast in the last and most heroic of these roles. It is the intertwining of the intellect and the ego which is so dangerous in making the vision highly resistant to any facts that could threaten the existing framework of beliefs and assumptions. Cultural wars are so desperate because they're not simply about the merits or demerits of particular policies. They're also about the Anointed's whole conception of themselves, about whether they're in the heady role of a vanguard or in the pathetic role of pretentious and self-infatuated people.
It is far easier to concentrate power than to concentrate knowledge.
Yes.
What bearing has that got on the influence that intellectuals have over society as a whole?
Because they believe that since knowledge is concentrated in people like themselves, what needs to be done is, in a quote from President Obama, is to put more power in the hands of the experts.
So the intellectual temptation is to say, look, we already know everything.
That's right.
If only we also had
The power.
all the power,
Yes.
everything would be just fine.
Yes.
And what's wrong with that view? Why isn't that a sensible view?
One, they don't know everything. They don't know 1/10 of everything. In fact, I argue that they probably don't know 1% of the consequential knowledge in a society.
Consequential knowledge is a concept that runs through this book. Explain that concept.
Knowledge whose presence or absence has consequences, serious consequences. I mean, I was once in a plane that was coming down for a landing in the Ithaca airport, and suddenly the pilot gunned the motor and went up again because someone in the control tower had reminded him that he hadn't lowered his landing gear. So that was consequential knowledge,
right?
Yes, yes. I was just delighted that person had his eyes open and his mind on his work.
So the notion here is that the kind of knowledge, the kind of consequential knowledge required to prove effective in governing a nation, such as the United States, with the biggest economy in the world, 300 million people, you can put together quite a large group of professors, and they're still not going to possess the knowledge that would enable them to run General Motors, for example, or to run the nation's healthcare system, for example.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that has happened all around the world in the 20th century was that all sorts of countries have tried central planning. Now, the guys who run the central planning, they usually have advanced degrees from prestigious institutions. They have mountains of statistics sitting there, and they have all the experts of the country at their beck and call. And yet when you take the power out of their hands and return it to the market, then all the hundreds of millions of people who don't have any of those things usually end up with a higher rate of growth and a more rapid decline in poverty.
Because consequential knowledge by its nature tends to be diffused, widely diffused.
Yes, yes.
All right. So why would the intellectuals, what you've just made is an intellectually rigorous case. Why would an intellectual, as you use the term, be loath to look at that intellectually rigorous argument, be loath to examine the data the way you did?
Well, he's happy with the data that he got. Well, why would he why would he go further? He looks at the numbers say what he thinks it should say. Hey, that's it. Right. QED, and he moves on to the next great crusade. Oh, yes.
Okay, so in other words, the intellectuals, the politicians are acting within a world of options that intellectuals have created over the decades.
Yes.
Right. And are you impressed by that, the intellectual framework?
No.
No. All right. All right. Segment 3, intellectuals and vision. Intellectuals in society. The vision around which most contemporary intellectuals tend to coalesce has features that distinguish it from other visions prevalent in other segments of contemporary society or among elites or masses in earlier times, close quote. What is the vision to which contemporary intellectuals subscribe?
That intellectuals should influence, if not control, the kinds of decisions that are made in society, and more especially that they should promote the transfer of decisions from the masses to those who have, quote, more intellect. And given how I conceive of knowledge being its distribution, that would mean transferring decisions from where there's 99% of the knowledge to where there's 1% of the knowledge. And against that background, it's not at all surprising that things like central planning simply don't produce as good results as allowing all the millions of people to react in the marketplace.